I'm Modia Silva, and welcome to another episode of Conscious Curiosity. In this episode, we get to meet Avrum Nadigel, who is a relationship and family dynamics expert. And through the conversation, we'll look at family structures and what makes them either stable or immature. And in particular, as we do that, we'll look at the promises that people make as they enter into relationships, either explicit promises like, this is the type of house that I want to live in, these are the number of children that I'd like to have, this is the type of relationship that I'd like. Those are the explicit promises, but there are implicit promises that we each make, either in relationship or just to ourselves. And often in relationships, we do not share what those implicit promises are with our partner. And so when they don't get met, it feels like somehow we've been violated by the other person. And so we'll take a look at that and dive in more detail into implicit promises. The practical application of everything that you'll listen to in this episode is helping you see the red flags of parenting and family life, and how we might step back to see the patterns that took us into that level of dysfunction and suffering. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome you to this episode and to Avrum Nadigel. And again, if you have any thoughts, comments, please let me know. Thank you. Enjoy. Hi, Avrum. Welcome to the show.
Modia, it's good to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much. We'll see what we're going to talk about. I have some ideas. I guess where I would like to start maybe is we're both therapists. We're both psychotherapists coming from different paths. And I'm curious because I guess as we develop as therapists, we start to mash up a lot of different modalities. But we have our preferred ones as well. And so mine is Gestalt and somatic experiencing, and yours is Bowen family systems. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that is fair to say.
Yeah. So given that both Gestalt and Bowen are not like soup du jour, they're not like the most popular therapeutic modalities today. How did you get drawn to it? Like, why that and not something that's more popular?
Yeah, I know it's a good question. When I was in graduate school at McGill in the mid 90s, my interest was in Freudian psychology. That was my goal, was to become, watching a lot of, Woody Allen movies. I thought that's what a therapist is, nice plush leather chair with books behind me. And so that's what I thought I was going to do. But we had to take certain introductory courses to different things. And one of them was a family therapy course. And so we learned about all the big ones like Mnuchin and Jay Haley and just a lot of those guys. Mm-hmm. But when we learned about a guy named Dr. Murray Bowen in the course, there was a description of triangles. I never heard of the term triangles before, but it was a description of triangles. And in the description, it said something like, two spouses don't get along. And the way they manage their conflict is they focus on the child. One spouse, let's say the mother, focuses on the child, sees a real or imagined problem in the child, and then the child responds in kind to the anxious focus, and then the mother and the son develop this kind of like fused relationship, and the father is on the outside of that triangle, right? Mm-hmm. And the marriage improves. I thought, hold on, this is describing my family. So the first thing I thought, it was the first theory that I discovered at McGill that really sort of, when we're learning about Freud, for example, I never really, it's like God, ego, superego, id, I couldn't, it kind of was a cool idea, but how do you know it's real, and how do you know it's true, and where exactly does it, live in the brain? And But that I could see because I was living that experience. My parents, one of the ways they managed their conflict, I didn't know this at the time, but I read the description, was that my mom and I were like best friends in a way. Now,
Hmm.
maladaptive best friends, but best
Right.
friends nonetheless. And what they said is that so long as a parent focuses on the child, the marriage will be steady for a long, long time, but the kid pays the price. And if the kid wants a healthy relationship later, then they're going to have to somehow break the triangle or something. And at the time I was 24, 25, my longest relationship was 2 weeks. And I thought, oh my God, like I'm doomed if I don't if I don't figure this thing out. It really was it hit me in a way that no other idea hit me. Like Mojo, when you're learning about like attachment or you're learning about Jung or Gestalt. I
Right.
mean, I never came across a psychotherapy idea that didn't sound interesting to me. They were all fascinating and very interesting. But this was the first idea that described in detail what I was experiencing in my family, and then it described in detail something I could actually do about it, as opposed to going to therapy for like 10 years talking about my childhood.
Right.
And so I went home. I'll never forget. I went home and I started doing this detriangling work. Caused more chaos in my family within 3 weeks than I was I had any idea what I was in for. Many years later, when my late supervisor and co-author of my latest book was working with me, I told him what I did after learning about triangles, and he goes, "It's you're lucky you didn't cause cardiac arrest in one of your parents." And he wasn't joking. He wasn't
Uh-huh.
joking. He was actually being serious. That people sometimes read systems theory and they get all excited and they go back into their family and they want to get into the secrets and they want to
Yeah.
and what happens is it's like any system. If you walk in like a bull in a china shop, there's going to be all of these forces that will push back against you, and then people can get sick and get very, very anxious. And so it turned out okay for me, but I would say it was a good, I'm going to say 2 years of
Mhm.
turbulence as I was trying to rework these triangles in my family. At times, I wasn't speaking with my mom, and then there were times my brother would get involved, and it caused a whole bunch of issues. But that
Right.
that was the beginning of my journey, I guess you could say, was that experience.
Right. So that's super interesting. And we're talking triangles, and I guess as soon as you get into bigger families or or newly formed families, through divorce and remarriage and so on, um, we're talking squares and pentagons and hexagons and octagons, and right, like the level of complexity just seems to go up significantly.
Yeah, the term that Dr. Bowen used was interlocking triangles. So
Uh,
what you have is, you have, your most basic triangle would be what I just described, a marital conflict with a focus on a child.
mhm.
But then, of course, then you have the father who's on the outside calling his sister saying, oh, like my son and my wife, like, they're always like, chatting about me. And the sister says, I told you should have never married her in the first
Right.
place. And then, so now it's father, sister with his wife on the outside of that triangle. Now,
Mm.
his wife is thinking, why is my sister not like me? Like, why is she
Right.
give me the cold
Right.
shoulder? And then his parents get involved. So what Dr. Bowen said is that his observation is the more anxious a family, or the word he would probably use is the more immature a family, emotionally immature, the more interlocking triangles that you have to stabilize the family.
Interesting.
And you're right, it gets
Right.
really, actually, Modya, it's really fascinating. We're talking about this. As you know, I do a podcast with a friend of ours, Ellie Bass, and the movie we're doing this week is The Royal Tenenbaums,
Oh, cool.
a
Yep.
great film from 2001.
Right. So I'm just going to pause you right there.
Sure.
Just for your publicity, name the pod. What's the name of the podcast?
Oh, the podcast is called Pop Parenting, and it is a podcast where Ellie Bass, who's the director of the Jewish Family Institute, and I choose a film. We started with the 80s and 90s, and now we're in the 2000s.
Mhm.
And we choose a film, and we talk about, generally it's parenting, but also marriage, so
Right.
relationships, and we try to
Uh-huh.
suss out. Where people get stuck in these films and what you can glean from a film to our own lives.
Right.
And so in this film, in The Royal Tenenbaums, it's full of triangles. So it's funny we're talking about this because I was just working on this before we spoke, and I'm doing the family diagram, this diagram of the movie and the family, and it's just full of triangles. And it just
Right.
so happens the Royal Tenenbaums, if you've seen the movie, is a very, very what can you say about them? Dysfunctional family. So you can really see the triangles. Actually, it's really neat.
Right. So it's really interesting because in my Gestalt training, we never taught triangles, but we definitely talked about family systems. And we talked about it through people like Virginia Satir and Kurt Lewin or Kurt Lewin. And then we would role play. So one of us, so let's say it was me, would stand up in the class of 20 plus people, stand in the middle of the room, and then I would select people from the class to place them physically in the room according to where I felt these family members were, like my mom, my dad, my siblings, right, in my life growing up. And then they would take on a dynamic role, and then suddenly it would be like, lights, camera, action, and everyone would actually start moving and talking. And it just, like, making it more than just talk therapy, making it more than just me talking about, oh, this was my family growing up, and actually acting it out just became so much more powerful.
That's a critical point that you're bringing up right now. Again, I have to just, in full disclosure here, I know, I would say zero but Gestalt, so I can't speak
Mhm.
to anything you just said about Gestalt therapy, but the general idea of the meandering psychotherapy that goes on for years talking about your family is something I personally experienced. I've been in that kind of therapy. I found it helpful to a point. There were many points along my journey doing that type of therapy, Moya, where I felt that there was a lot of navel gazing and where exactly is this going? When I discovered family systems theory, mind you, I found out that Dr. Bowen, when he was training psychiatry residents, they were all psychoanalysts because he was practicing sort of in the 50s, and that's where all
Right.
psychiatrists were psychoanalysts working with schizophrenia. And these psychiatry residents were used to psychoanalytic training, which is where you sit there, you talk about your family, just as you said, you spend years and years sort of trying to analyze your family. And his approach was, well, he started off as an analyst, but then he moved away from that. His approach was very similar to what you just said, except not within a group of your peers. But his idea was that a psychiatry resident would come in, for example, and say to him, I can't get through to this patient. I'm really stuck. And he
Mhm.
would say to them, kind of like with your uncle, huh?
Oh, right.
And he would say to the resident, maybe you should put down the textbook and
Nice.
stop reading about this and go back and see if you can make any headway with that uncle you haven't spoken to. And the general idea is that if you can't do in your family, you won't be able to do in the clinical office. So the
Mhm.
idea is that if you're cut off from your father, you are going to find your father over and over and over and over again in the clinical room, and you will get stuck, and you're going to try to work really hard with your client. The client's going to pick up on this weird kind of like, why are you're working harder than me here on this thing, and you're going to get gridlocked. So very in spirit, that's exactly what the path of what a systems therapist and their training is, as you say.
Right. Right. Well, it also leans into where I think most therapy has gone today, which is a relational therapy, where it's not just the therapist sitting back listening to stories, right? But the therapist becomes part of the system as well, part of that, well, the system for that hour, right, during that process. And it makes it relational and more present centered, which brings things up that otherwise don't come up. Like the mind is so clever and so fast at hiding and deflecting and blocking, and right, but when it's in the moment and it's relational, it gets harder to do that.
Hmm.
How do you, so you see families, right, in that, because I remember Virginia Satir was sort of the first one to bring more than one family member into a room at one time, or at least it's written up to be that way, that
Yeah,
back in, right? So she would bring the entire family in and then do these family dynamic exercises.
I don't know. I don't know again, my history of the origins of bringing in more than one person into the room, couples or families. I forget who it was, but I know Satir was part of that whole group of, again, Haley, Mnuchin, Bowen.
Mhm.
They were all sort of moving away from that psychoanalyst hour, the clinical hour with one person. Anyway, so please continue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so I'm just curious, like someone walks in and it's a couple or it's an entire family, and it can go from 0 to 100 pretty quickly in a therapy room, right? How do you tease apart what the fundamental problems are so that then you can actually start to work either as a unit, as a systems unit, or with individuals within that system?
I think it's important to point something out here, and this is not the fault of people who hear family systems or family therapy and they think, oh, well, you work with the whole family, because the word family is in there. It's kind of like mindfulness-based stress reduction. You go to your
Right.
first mindfulness-based stress reduction, and the teacher always says the same thing. If you're here to reduce your stress, and you're going to focus, you're not going to reduce your stress. And you're thinking, well, can I have my money back? Because it says mindfulness-based stress reduction, right? So it says family. So of course people think, well, I work with families. The truth of the matter, Moji, is I rarely work with families. I rarely see an entire family. It happens, I would say, for me, once every couple of years where I'm working with, let's say, more than two people. Generally what happens is, so just to be clear, family systems theory is a way of understanding how humans function and how symptoms develop. So symptoms could be anything from back pain to depression to psychosis, whatever. It's just a way of understanding the way human beings function. But the practical part of the therapy, how my calls are usually just, it's either I get a call from a mom saying that my 16-year-old son has been suspended from school. It's been an ongoing thing. We've been bringing them to different CBT therapists. They say maybe you should try family therapy. So that's one way I get calls.
Right.
And so in cases like that, I usually start with the couple. It always starts with the couple. And because I've written books on marriage, I'd say 95% of my practice right now is relationship oriented. So a lot of marriage work. And in that case, when couples call me, they don't expect me to bring in the entire family. But what will happen, though, is that you start with the couple, and then maybe 6 months later, you find out that mom hasn't spoken to her sister in 4 years and that she's interested. And so there I might work with, which is very different than more of a psychodynamic therapist who would never see, the sibling. In my case, it's part of the therapy. So I might start with a husband and a wife, and then 6 months later, I'm seeing the wife and her sister. And that's all part of working within the system.
Right. Cool. Cool. And it's a bit of I'm going to kind of leap a little bit, but have you noticed a shift in any way during COVID? So we're like 15 or so months in now, right, in the West, in North America. What are you noticing, if anything?
You mean noticing how it's impacting the families I'm working
Yeah.
with?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, oh, we can spend so long on this, both of us, in terms of what we've observed, both in the work that we do and the communities that we're in. I can tell you that for sure, whenever you hear a generalized statement of how families are handling the pandemic, you can just write it off as nonsense. So this idea that there's this universal experience of how people are handling the pandemic is just, it's silly. It plays well maybe on cbc.ca, so on our national news broadcaster,
Right.
that, all marriages, all families, it's absolutely false. First of all, some people are thriving. And I know it's a pain point to hear that. It bothers people. They don't want to hear that kind of thing. But look, if you were working for Zoom pre-pandemic, you had a fledgling little company, you're hoping you would do well, you're a programmer for Zoom. And now 15 months later, you're at the most, powerful, perhaps influential, tech company. Look, financially, you're doing very, very well. Plus the whole platform is built for something like this. okay, you probably can afford a nice home, so you have lots of space for your kids, top of the line computers for your kids' online learning. So I think we have to be clear here. I would say many people are struggling with the pandemic. Some people are thriving. And I think that if we really have to wait, I would say 2 years to 3 years to really get a better understanding of how the pandemic is going to be impacting things like marriage. You hear a lot of people saying that, oh, well, the pandemic is just buckling marriages and people are getting divorced left, right, and center. I don't see that in my practice. That is not what I see. I do see a buckling under the strain of managing the kids at home with virtual learning and being under the same roof and this. But I also have, by the way, Modya, I have families saying to me that, I never saw my kids before, and I
Uh-huh.
see them now, and I'm interacting with them, and although they drive me crazy, some parents will say to me, I'm actually lamenting the day they go back to school because it's kind of nice to get to know my kids in this way. So I think that every family has different resources, you know. Um, I mean, I can just go on and on about this. I think the general idea here is that blanket statements about how COVID is impacting families, it just isn't helpful.
So, so I hear that, and obviously, there are whatever 7 billion people on the planet, right? There can't be one answer for everybody. Um, and also, I actually just read, so this is topical, that Bill and Melinda Gates are getting divorced.
Yes, yes, it's a big topic of conversation online right now.
Right. So I'm sure there'll be lots of people saying, oh, I guess they couldn't survive COVID. Right.
Well, it's an interesting thing, right? Because Madhya, you and I have been alive long enough to to notice that famous people, whether they get married or split up, it has a sort of a meta meaning in the culture. Like
Mm-hmm.
it means something. So like
Yes.
it's a weird thing, and I think that has something to do with the cult of celebrity. And I guess maybe once upon a time when people were more God-fearing, people would look for their meaning in terms of their community and their self, and so to a deity or to a divine law. Now, really, when you think about it, most people ascribe some sort of power to some sort of cult, and it could be a prime minister or a president it doesn't make a difference, but it's just to another human being. So it's an interesting thing because I really think certain people who feel very strongly about, let's say the Obamas, if the Obamas
Mm-hmm.
got divorced, I know people who would be crushed, just completely crushed, because
Right.
they saw the Obamas as just, this is what a marriage is, and this is what happiness looks like, and I want that. I'm sure people feel the same way about this relationship, and I think it's a sign of a little bit of, I would say, societal immaturity, that we don't find it within ourselves that there's something that we're lacking within ourselves that informs us of how a marriage works or doesn't work, right? And that we look outside of ourselves and we go, oh, it didn't work. Oh God. Okay. So, like I'm in trouble. And I really
Right.
do think people see that this split, right, with Bill Gates and his
Yep.
wife as being some sort of, oh God, now I'm in trouble. I think people are taking it very personally, at least the way they're
Oh, I
talking
think
about online.
so. Well, I think so too. And I mean, this is sort of a big topic, but I think it goes all the way back to school. Like, I look for role models of what is a successful relationship, what's a successful marriage or open relationship or whatever style of relationship. And I never had a course at school that helped me in that area. I never had a course at university that helped me in that area. Right. And so I fashion it based on social norms and culture. And yeah, and then something tells me, yeah, if you have, I don't know how many billions of dollars they have, but multiple billions of dollars, right? If you have that much money, you can actually buy happiness, or you can actually buy a therapist to come and work with you every day. You can buy stability in a relationship. And it is hard to put all that aside and say, no, it actually doesn't necessarily work that way. But I'm with you. Like, if the Obamas split, I think that would be a big thing. If who are the family therapists on the West Coast in Seattle?
Or the
Um,
Gottmans.
yeah. So if they split, I think they're a second marriage, aren't they? I think both of them were married before,
It's
or
possible.
one was, but yeah, like if they split, it's like, oh my gosh, if I put all my weight into a particular theory that they've created, that's how you have a successful anything, and they can't make it happen, then what am I left with? Like, where's my foundation and support for my marriage? I think.
Yeah, no, I think it's true. Look, I mean, my parents, I come from divorce in my family. I don't think divorce or marriage was explained to me with any degree of sophistication at all. It seemed like a crapshoot. I mean, that's sort
Yeah.
of how I grew up. And it was only until I started on this path as a therapist and discovered the work of David Snarch, Dr. David Snarch, who also happens to the foundational part of his book, Passionate Marriage, was on family systems theory. I didn't know at the time when I found the book that I started to have a more sophisticated understanding of how people come together, how people split up. And that was I was 32 when I discovered that. I was a practicing therapist at that point for about 7 years, 8 years. I had no foundation to understand this at all. So I hear you.
Right.
Yeah.
So, okay, so I read David Schnarch's book, right? Schnarch, right?
Yeah. Who, by the way, we just say the late David Starr. She died a
Oh,
few months ago.
oh, he did.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
sorry to hear that. So I
Yeah.
read Passionate Marriage. I found it incredibly dense and difficult. I know you've written a couple of relationship books. How would you take like what's your I don't know what my question is, but how do you go from like a David Schnarch, rest his soul, to you coming with something that's much more accessible and palatable in terms of anyone could pick up your book and kind of and get value out of it to help them with relationships. What did, what was your approach to not write another passionate marriage, dense, difficult to understand book?
Well, first of all, let me eat some humble pie here. The reason why I couldn't write a book like that is because, and I don't think I'm just putting myself down. I'm not as theoretical and research driven as David Snarch was. I mean, he was, his original work was being cited by Master and Johnson, and I mean, the biggest sex researchers in the country were using his material. So his main thing was research, and clinical work was sort of a secondary thing. So I just have to put that out there that if I could, I probably would have, but it's not in my wheelhouse. And the other thing I have to say, just to provide some context here, I went to a talk in Vancouver. I talk about this a lot in my book, but I went to a talk. I was single, and I was really afraid I'd be single the rest of my life because at the time I was 30. I was 32, 33, and I'd never had a relationship at that point longer than about 2 months. And I was just, there was me in the room with a whole bunch of other single 40, 50 somethings. And we were all pretty sure we were just going to die that way. But we keep showing up to these singles talks in the Jewish community in Vancouver because, you're always hoping, right? You don't give up hope. You're going to meet someone at one of these events. And at this event I went to, Dr. David Freeman, who would become my supervisor, was speaking, and he spoke about marriage, Modya, in a way that I never heard of before. Just never heard of before. For example, I'll just throw one thing at you here. So he said in this talk that when couples come to his office and they're stuck, he always asks them the following question: what was the implicit promise you made to each other that you didn't share with each other, but that has been violated? I thought to myself, what was the implicit? So it's not explicit. So it's not like, I want 2 kids and you say, I agree with you. And then 5 years into the marriage, I say, I only want 1.
Right.
I mean, that's a problem, but that's not what he's
Right.
talking about. What he's talking about is so my wife's Eliza. So when Avrum married Eliza, I secretly had a promise that Eliza would fulfill certain things. I never shared it with her. And then she violates it down the road and I'm furious with her. Right. So I thought, wow, that's so interesting that couples make these implicit promises. And so that piqued my interest. So I was ripe for that kind of psychological trickery about marriage. And
Yeah.
so after David's talk, I raised my hand and I said to him during the Q&A, David, I'm reading a book by a woman named Dr. Harriet Lerner. called The Dance of Intimacy. And it sounds a lot like what you're saying. And then a woman stands up, Modja, in the crowd and says, oh, if you like Dr. Lerner and this talk, you should read Dr. David Snarch.
Aha.
Now, I'd only find out later that Dr. Lerner trained with Bowen, that Dr. Freeman trained with Bowen, and that Snarch, I didn't know all this at the time. But when this woman said that, I was ripe for it. So yes, when I read the book, it was dense. I had to read the first few chapters of this book over and over, but there was something, Modja, when you're ripe for the knowledge. And so you're going to put in the work, So I think Passionate Marriage is the kind of book you gotta, it's like either your marriage is falling apart or like me, someone said there's this gift, but you gotta struggle with it. So I have to say, while it was dense, it was the most important, and nothing has come close since, the most important work for me. A year later, I met Eliza and we got married, and I credit it to David's work. By the way, before he died, a couple of years before he died, I was in email correspondence with him, and I told him this story about his book and my wife and all this kind of stuff. When I wrote my book, my first book, Learning to Commit. I always sort of positioned it as a prequel to Passionate Marriage, because when you read Passionate Marriage, he's talking about the couple who's married 20 years, who hasn't had sex in 5 years, and they're on the verge of divorce. That really is what the book is geared towards.
Yep.
But throughout the book, there was so much there that I thought is applicable to singles. And so all I did was, instead of, emailing David every, 3 weeks saying, are you going to write the book for singles, David? Are you going to write the book for singles? I thought, okay, I'll give it a kick in the can. I wanted to make it a bit more accessible than his book. And that's how it happened.
That's great. So when you write a book for singles, I really like what you said before about implicit promises. Like, we make implicit promises to ourselves, not even to our partners, right? So does your book, do you dive into that at all? Like for self-reflection, or now, for any of the listeners to this episode, if they want to actually just sit back and ask, what is the actual question they'd ask themselves about implicit promises?
Well, I think the first thing that David's book did for me, and that I try to do in Learning to Commit, is to explain the natural arc of emotionally committed relationships, meaning that the things that we say to ourselves, like you and I, when you grow up and no one tells you about the natural arc of a human emotional relationships, committed relationships, commonly known as marriage. When you don't know what you're up against, when things get rocky, you think there's something wrong with either your partner, yourself, or the relationship. For example, what I think I used this example in one of my books. If you go to the gym and you have a trainer, and the trainer doesn't say to you, after we do our workout together, the next morning, you're going to be sore.
Right.
If the trainer doesn't tell you, you're going to wake up the next morning, fire the trainer because you can't move, right? And you're not going to go back to the gym again because you're going to think this is too painful. It shouldn't be this way.
Right.
Okay? But if a trainer tells you, after we're finished, by the way, tomorrow morning, drink water, drink lots of fluids, don't pick, you're going to be really sore. Or if you get your vaccine, for example, and they say to you, your arm's going to be really painful. If you don't know that, you're going to think you have a blood clot or something horrible because your arm's really sore. So I think that what I try to do in my book is to explain to very anxious singles, because my first book was geared towards commitment phobia, is that there are powerful reasons why you are defended against bringing someone into your life. Okay. For most people who struggle with commitment phobia, for most people who are anxious, it's usually for a number of reasons. One of them is because the marriages they saw growing up, their parents' marriages, especially of a certain generation where there was a lot of divorce, they look at that and they think, why the hell would I want that? And I don't see any other good examples. So if that's what that is, I want something else. Because if all I see is my parents and their friends' marriages, so I see either a divorce or I see people who are married who are looking into the soup at dinner at a restaurant, and whatever's in the soup is more fascinating than what's sitting across from them, right? Well, then I'm going to be into polyandry or polygamous or whatever the hell they're going to be into, but it's not going to be emotionally committed monogamous relationships. But if you explain to people that the natural arc of a marriage is that at some point you're going to be bored, and that's where the growth begins.
Hmm.
Ah, ah. So it's part of the process, you mean? Oh, I didn't realize. You mean, oh, hot sex always happens in the beginning and then peters out over time, and then it gets gridlocked, and then at some point you have to learn how to have mature sex? No one told me that. Like, no, all I knew was that sex is natural. Isn't that what, animals do? Right? Like, no one
Right,
tells
right,
you that
right.
stuff. So my book
Yeah.
was a way of trying to explain to singles that everything you're afraid of is going to happen, but it's normal. And here's some ways that you can prepare for it. That's generally what my book was about.
Nice. So that's great. That's great. And I would add, so I really like that. And then because I have a somatic experiencing background as well, so in trauma therapy, I would add that there is that if there's any sort of childhood trauma around relationships, around seeing failed relationships, let's say, that you can tell people as much as you want, but the body has to catch up. Like the traumatized body, meaning the nervous systems, have to catch up to what the intellectual piece of you already knows or has been taught. And so it could be that I'm single and I'm sitting across on a first date from this woman, and she just moves her head in a certain way, and I don't know what goes on, but suddenly I just get afraid. And it's like, oh, it's because that marriage that fell apart when I was a kid, they had the exact same movements. That's the way they held their head. That's the way this happened. And right. And so I think it's also education of the body, of the nervous system, as well as education of the mind.
Yeah, it's funny you're bringing back a memory to me that I haven't thought of in a while. That until I got better at this thing, meaning in the anxiety I would feel in my body when I would get almost repulsed. I'd
Mm-hmm.
be on these dates and would go, 5, 6 dates. I was really into the woman, and then all of a sudden, my interest would wane, and then this like revulsion would kick in, and I didn't know what to do with it because it was it was as you say, it was physiological. It wasn't just cognitive. You couldn't talk me out of it.
Mm-hmm.
I felt it in my body. um so it's funny, I haven't thought about that in a long time, but it was powerful, and the only way I knew how to deal with it was to break off the relationship, and then I would get to a homeostasis, calm again. I would be at a base level. I would be single, but at least I was calm. And so I really had to learn. I really had to learn and work very hard, very hard, on how to deal with that. And if anyone bumps into my wife, you can ask her what it was like being engaged to me. I'm sure she'll share some horror stories.
But it's very cool. I'm just looking at my bookshelf. I think the title of the book is How Emotions Are Made, and I cannot remember the author's name, her. Anyway, but she tells like a similar story of going out on this first date with a guy that she really did not want to go with. She didn't know why she went. And she was like violently sick. And she just assumed it was a sign to say, do not go out with that guy again. But then she went home and she had like a horrible flu. So it was, so there
Well,
is,
but David Snarch, by the way, one of the lines that I thought was very easy to grasp. I didn't find this was dense. He has a few. He was great with one-liners, and one of his lines in Passionate Marriage was that everybody marries for the wrong reasons. It takes staying married to find out what the right reasons are. And I
no.
remember when I heard that line, I was like, oh, maybe I'm breaking up too quick. Like maybe the problem isn't me, and maybe the problem isn't the woman I'm dating, but maybe the problem is that when the going gets tough,
Mhm.
I misinterpret that as something's wrong. But what if I could have some sort of skill set to stay with the discomfort? There might be something on the other side of that. And I never did that.
Right.
And so, yeah, I know it's a
Right. And
interesting point.
so your partner really becomes a gift in the way that you go, ugh, I wish they'd change in this way. But really, by them not changing, it gives you an opportunity for growth.
Well,
Right.
yeah, I mean, look, this is one of these lines that whenever I mention this in a workshop, people kind of scratch their heads, and it's a hard one to sort of wrap your head around. But I have noticed this as a clinical observation. One of Dr. Bowen, part of his research of families, one of the things that he said, and he was very was fond of saying, is that we marry people at the same level of emotional maturity or immaturity as ourselves. And people who end their relationships do not like this line because they want to assume they married a monster. But
Right.
according to Bowen, it's not perfect. It's not 50-50. So it might be
Right.
55-45 or something, but
Hmm.
it's not, the difference is not 70-30.
Right.
And that there is some sort of inner knowledge, some sort of instinctual something or other, the way dogs sniff each other's, behinds to
Yeah.
figure out,
Yeah.
I want to mate with that one. I don't know how they know that, but that's what they do. Humans have a similar process. And when we let someone into our lives, and let's say we make it past 8 months, I think, I've heard 8 months, 9 months, whatever, but you make it past the initial, whatever it is, that there is some sort of internal comfort of two people who have similar levels of emotional maturity. And once I understood that, it was like, Moja, it was like all of a sudden the gates flew open. And I actually, when I learned that, I was excited now to date. I was excited now to see what was beyond my discomfort. But until I had that, all I interpreted this discomfort was something that my mother shared with me when I was a little boy. I'll never forget. She said to me, if it doesn't feel right, end it.
Uh-huh.
And
Right.
so that's what I did. I mean,
Right.
by the way, my mom and I are very close. God bless her, but I think a lot of people feel that. Moja, how many people do you know, if you said to them, you called up your best friend, you said, oh, my wife and I, it's been 3 months. We're just not getting along. We're not, like, I don't know, we're not having sex. How many of your friends would say, maybe you should leave? Like, maybe
Right.
maybe
Yeah.
it's time to leave.
Hmm.
Because human beings, especially in the West, we really don't know what to do with discomfort. We're very allergic to discomfort. It makes us very anxious.
Right. So practically then, for the people listening, if they're in a relationship, how do they start to recognize, like your mom said, feel your gut, like if it doesn't feel right, leave. But how do you start to recognize when stress becomes distress? That the problem has become bigger than you can just, go sit on your cushion and meditate for half an hour and be fine after.
Do you mean when people call me for therapy?
Well, sure, when they call you or before they call you, but or they know that they need to call a therapist. So a lot of people listening to this podcast are, regular folk. They're not, some will be therapists and many won't. Um, and I guess, my audience looks for some practical advice sometimes. So I guess that's what I'm asking is, someone could be saying, I'm in a relationship. I don't know. There's a lot of love, but we just kind of fight a lot and something. And then, it's like, that's okay. But then suddenly, like, they seem to step over a threshold and stress becomes distress. Like, it just
Sure.
goes one step too far in the relationship.
Yeah. So I'm going to say something here that's going to sound, I don't know, maybe a bit over the top, but I really believe this to be so. It kind of reminds me. I had a friend, Moja, in Vancouver, whose father owned he owned the old film house in, I'm going to say this wrong, Roncesvalles. Am I saying it right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Roncesvalles.
Roncesvalles. Yeah.
And he was an English professor, but he always wanted to be a therapist. And he went and studied with Louis von Franz in Switzerland, who was Jung's student.
Mhm.
And he trained to become a Jungian analyst. He came back to Toronto, and my friend told me his father really believed that Jungian psychology could change the world. He was committed to the day he died that if people just embrace Jungian psychology, our world would be better. Well, I feel the same way. And my clinical supervisor would be slapping me across the head with a 2x4 if she heard me say this. But I feel the same way. So I have made it my mission to give workshops and write books for people with the general idea of if you have even a cursory understanding of the 8 interlocking concepts of Bowen theory, you will be able to identify the unfinished business in your family. And by doing so, you will be able to see the red flags that you will find in your parenting and in your marriage, even if you're single. So I guess what I'm saying is that what I tell people is that going into marriage therapy when your marriage is on the cusp of ending, the stats aren't great. I don't care. Family systems, attachment, Gottman, who's attachment. I mean, essentially, if you're going in and there's too much water under the bridge,
Yeah.
the research suggests that marriage therapy has a pretty piss poor record at that point. So I think that if you could do the work up front and see, go back to your family of origin. So I'm talking about your nuclear family and some of your extended family. All of the stuff is predictive, all of it. So I'll give you an example. So let's say there's a young, happens not often, but every now and then someone will read my book and they'll call me and they're in a new relationship and everything's great. There's no problem, by the way. They just want to come and see me because they don't want the marriage their parents had. I get calls like that, right?
Right.
So, but they don't know what to do because everything is great, because everything in the beginning is always great for most people.
Uh-huh.
So what I do is I say, you know what, we're not going to talk about communication and compromise and sex. We're not going to talk about that. What we're going to do is we're going to try to understand how your family operates when anxiety goes to 11. Right. So we'll go back into their family. We'll do this. And then I find out, oh, well, that's interesting. So your parents divorced when you were 15. Your mom and your dad could only talk through a lawyer. To this day, they still talk through a lawyer, right? You think that the marriage ended because your mom was right and your dad was wrong. That information alone tells me everything I need to know about where you're going to get stuck with your spouse 10 years later. Because if you don't get to a point where you see your parents, okay, as two human beings who came together, right, for very powerful reasons, and they ended for powerful reasons, and that it is reciprocal. It is not cause and effect. It is not your father's affair that led to the divorce. The affair was a symptom of something that went amiss for years and years before that. If you don't understand that, you're going to have a lot of problems in 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. So what I tell people is that you don't even need a therapist for this. You can read about the 8 concepts online. You can buy, Dr. Roberta Gilbert has a wonderful book about the 8 concepts. And once you arm yourself with a general foundational knowledge of how human functioning works, how family systems work, you can apply that at work, you can apply that in marriage. And I do have to say one other thing, by the way. I think it's also true that any theory, I really believe this, by the way, Madhya, any theory is better than no theory. So what I mean is, if someone were to come to me and say to me, are you saying family systems theory is the only theory? Absolutely not. Absolutely. If attachment theory works for you and it gives you a roadmap and a lighthouse for your darkness or for your turbulence, right? It's better than no lighthouse every single time, right? So that's what I would tell people is that, you know, dig into some of these isms, right? Explore some different ideas and then pick something that you think will steady your ship when the seas get rocky in all of your relationships, family and romantic.
Right. I think that's great. And societal and individual, right? Like when I start to kind of just lose it, not in relationship, or when I'm out in the workplace or in a larger societal gathering, and I feel like, where am I going to lose it here? Right? Because I have a lot of clients, especially now, I don't know, especially now, but I have a lot of clients who come in saying they have social anxiety, right?
Right.
And I just start, and it's like, okay, so we can talk about the context, we can talk about the content of your life, but underlying, it's all, whether it's you and your family, at work, in a relationship, it doesn't matter. It's all, you're going to get triggered in the same way. And so I always start with, what do you mean by anxiety? Like, how do you define your anxiety? And then we build from there, and it just becomes a bit more universal. I imagine you have a lot of people coming talking about anxiety as well, whether it's COVID related or just in general relationship anxieties.
Well, I mean, people talk about, I mean, we talk more about psychotherapy and mental health issues now in 2021 than we ever did in the past. And my hunch is it's going to continue this way. And I'm still not sure if that's good or bad. I think that words like, you know, empathy and toxicity and I know you used the word trauma, but I mean, we're growing up with these ideas, and I can't tell if this is gridlocking people into adopting sort of the it's almost like a part of their personality, you know, that I was diagnosed with access to this, and that there's nowhere to go. I mean, it's like, you know, there's nowhere to move from that.
Right.
From a family systems perspective, symptoms, all symptoms from schizophrenia down, right? All symptoms are seen as a continuum. So, and it has to do with some sort of combination of neurochemical, psychological, environmental, but all the way to sibling position, hair color, which parent focused on which sibling, which child more. And so it's complex. And so when clients come into my office, and they say to me that they're anxious, at some point, I do see my job as, psychoeducational to describe how anxiety is normal. It's part of, one way that human beings protect themselves, and all
Mhm.
mammals do, and that it could be maladaptive, but to describe it as not something that is something to get rid of. That I think if you're
Right.
human and there's, my late supervisor used to say, so long as there's poverty, illness, and death and
Yes.
war, right? Human beings have dis-ease,
Right.
with their
Yes.
world.
Yeah.
But I have to say, no, like it is something that I've thought about the normalization of mental health issues as a lifestyle almost. It's really interesting.
Mhm.
My clients come in and they sort of see themselves as this thing, as if it's
Right.
them.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Where I
So
see it as more as a symptom that ebbs and flows.
right. And I also I tell them that I hold my frames very loosely, and that I'm not a DSM guy who's going to say, "Oh, that's the label that you just stuck on yourself. Therefore, I know exactly who you are." But I like that people are using this language more, um, and I do see it as my role to help sort of tweak and have them explore their definition, like the definitions they're coming in with, and share anything that I have. So for example, anxiety. Um, a Gestalt definition of anxiety is excitement without support, meaning that I have this energy in my body that is excitement, but I don't have adequate internal supports or external supports to channel it effectively. And so it takes me into this thing called anxiety, which ultimately might lead into this thing called a panic attack. And right. And when I say something like that, it's like, oh my gosh, okay, so it's not just a label, and it actually is something I can work with, because you're telling me that it's normal. Like you keep saying, if you just normalize it, then it's normal. It's normal to have this level of energy in my body. Now I just need to support it better,
Right.
as opposed to get rid of it.
Yeah. I mean, one of the ways that I talk about anxiety, and again, my frame is coming from a systems frame, but one of the ways that I talk about anxiety um, is very different than how people come. Because when people come into my office, they see anxiety as something in them, that it
Mhm.
is something in them. And so they'll say whether it's serotonin or dopamine or whatever, but
Right,
they're talking about their brain.
right.
Um, in a family systems context, a symptom like anxiety is the result of something changing in the family
Mhm.
system.
Mhm.
Where, let's say you have a couple, right, Moja? And one is an extrovert and one is an introvert. And when the extrovert gets anxious, they get extroverted. And when an introvert gets anxious, they get
Yeah.
introverted. And they work really well as a couple like that for 20
Uh-huh.
years, right? For 20 years, they work well
Right.
like that. And then the extrovert's father dies and was a very important person in the family.
Mhm.
And the extrovert gets depressed and sad and starts to become introverted.
Right.
And then the introvert doesn't know what to do with their spouse, right?
Yeah.
And they get really uncomfortable. And now their marriage that was working fine for 20 years because of the homeostasis, now their marriage becomes very conflictual. And all of a sudden their kids, right? One starts getting a panic attack right around the time the grandfather died, maybe 3 months
Mhm.
after the grandfather died. So what I tell people, what I try to explain to people is that your symptoms aren't just in you. Yes, there's a neurochemical part. Yes, there's a psychological thing.
Right.
But when I do a timeline, and I do a timeline with all of my clients, it is uncanny how often psychological symptoms pop up when 4 months before something changed in the family system that created sort of like a shock wave, right?
Mhm.
And then, one uncle gets back pain, someone gets diagnosed with cancer, this person gets depression. It's fascinating. And when you put it on paper, people are like, son of a gun. Like I never saw the connection with any of that kind of stuff. And now you have options. Now there are more options. I mean, nothing wrong with psychotropic medication. If my clients need Ativan, I support their choice. So let me be clear. I'm absolutely fine with whatever people have to do to get on with their lives. But I do see it as my role to broaden your options, to have more options than just going to your GP and saying, can we up the dose of this thing?
Okay, cool. All right. So Avrum, I know we're going to run out of time. We could talk a lot more about a lot of things. I want to end then quickly in 2 minutes to ask you 3 questions.
Shoot.
First question. What's on your bedside table?
I'm reading a book on fiction about the Warsaw Ghetto called, I think it's Mila 18. I forget the author. You probably know the author. It's called, the book is called Mila 18, about the Warsaw Uprising. So that's what I'm reading for fiction.
Nice.
And clinically, right now, I'm not reading. I'm watching for the first time Dr. Bowen's original 8-part video series he created in the 1970s about all his concepts. So each one is an hour. So I'm on concept number 4. So that's what I'm.
Okay, nice.
Stuff. Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay. Second question. What is your superpower?
It's going to sound like, I would say my superpower probably is being a contrarian.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. I'm going to get you a t-shirt made.
A t-shirt.
It'll just be a big C across the shirt.
Big middle finger. Yes.
Excellent. And then the third question is going to come from this book. I'm going to flip through this book. Every page has a question on it.
Okay.
You just tell me when to stop.
Sure. Stop.
Stop. How old would you be if you didn't know how old you were?
How old would I be if I didn't know? That's a good question. How old would I be if I didn't know how old I was? Good one. 36. 36.
That's almost the answer to the universe. That's great. Okay, I know we have to end.
That was fun with you. Thank you.
It was fun for me too. Thanks so much. We can do it again if we want.
Great.
Yeah. Avrum Nadigel was my guest today on Conscious Curiosity. And thanks so much for listening.
Thanks for having me.
See you next time. Take care, Avrum.